We will be today discussing how we can identify and remove barriers for young adult carers as we support them into exploring opportunities, into gaining employment opportunities, and then once they're in work, how we can support and develop people to kind of move forward and progress in the way that we all want to be able to when we start our work. At Youth Employment UK, we are really pleased and proud that we are able to support not just the Carers Trust, but to be able to support employers to have these conversations with target groups and demographics as we look, as we will in a moment, at how youth employment and youth unemployment and economic activity and the effects that has on young people, and how we can support more employers to engage with things like the youth guarantee. There isn't a more important time to really look and understand the different groups and be able to really work with them and for them to create better, meaningful employment opportunities. In terms of today, if you've been to a youth employment webinar today, if you've been to a youth employment webinar before, you are hugely welcome, as are those who have never been. But usual rules apply. Please mute your microphone during the session. We will be engaging, having space and holding time for questions and discussions. There will be some vibes later on. You can unmute then, but for the time being, particularly as we have our speakers coming in, please mute yourself and be ready. There is a chat box, please use that feature. And yes, to get all of those questions out of the way already, this webinar will be recorded and we will share slides too. So if anyone asks that question, we can all giggle at them later when we come through. You can keep your camera on, but with the warning that this will be recorded and put into our members dashboard area and used as content across our website. So if for any reason that means you'd like to take your camera off, we won't be offended. But if you are showing your face, smile, be ready. We're all here to take part in it. Also, there will be a feedback form that comes at the end of this session too. Our marketing and policy team work really hard to pull these sessions together, as have the Carers Trust, bringing Andy, Danny and Rebecca here today for your time. So actually having that brilliant feedback, understanding what's really worked for you, but also having those conversations about what you'd like to see more of and see next is also just as important. So I know we like to click off those buttons as surveys come through, but it's a really important part of our process here. And I'd love to be able to share back with Andy, Danny and Rebecca some brilliant feedback as to how the session has gone. In terms of today's agenda, we'll be speaking and spending a little bit of time on the youth employment landscape generally, but then we are moving fast into the picture for young carers and what that means. We're going to be supported by Rebecca and Daniel to really understand what practical support for young carers we as employers and those working in the system can put in place. And then you'll see your moment and time to shine too. We'll be opening up for Q&As. Please feel free throughout the session to put questions in and we'll pick them up at that point, or save them. Cross your fingers and try and remember what you were going to say at the very end. So in terms of youth unemployment, there has never been a time, well, certainly in my lifetime, that young people in youth employment have been on the agenda so much and so much at the forefront. For the very first time, we have a youth strategy, we have a youth guarantee for young people, we have so much opportunity at the moment, and it comes at a time of some real big challenges for our young people too. So whilst this is brilliant, and we celebrate that. We celebrate our work as part of the Youth Employment Group and Youth Employment UK's very own kind of championing across policy to really put things like the Youth Guarantee in place. But actually, it's because it's more needed than ever. Overall, there's 957,000 NEET young people aged between 16 and 24. This number has remained largely the same as it was in 2010, and it really shows how stubborn and enduring the problem is for our young people. We have seen cycles happening to young people. We have seen different initiatives take place, and yet still there is not just a large number of NEET young people, but what feels like a growing one. And as we start to now understand more around the data for young people, not only do we know more about the scarring effect that being NEET has on our young people, even for a shorter period of 6 months or so, but we are also understanding more about some of the reasons why young people become NEET, but also some of the demographics in and around our NEET young people that can make it all the more challenging to seek or be able to be, or kind of have help be readily accessible for them. What we have seen in terms of one of the changes in that time period is there's a 70% increase in the last decade in the number of young people reporting being NEET due to a work limiting condition. That's either a physical or mental health related condition for our young people. As I say, as we start to dig into and understand the data more, we are able to more clearly see what might be keeping young people out of work and how we can respond as players in the system, but also employers to do that. There's been a lack of progress. We can also see in the unemployment rate for young people not in full-time education, which in the latest data set is the highest it's been since 2014. Economic inactivity among young people has also increased by 0.4% in recent months. All of this underscores that in addition to rates being similar to what they were years ago, they're also worsening. So as you might look at these graphs and figures, you're like, oh, they don't look too bad, they look around the same, but once you dig in and underneath the data, there's some really worrying trends that you'll start to see. Why are so many young people NEET? There's lots of reasons. There's lots of reasons why, and there isn't a perfect formula. We'll see and engage. What we do know about young people is who you are, who you're born to, and where you're born still play some of the biggest factors in terms of young people being able to see opportunity and access opportunity, as it highlights too. We've pulled together some of really important data that sits in and around what we do know about young people who are NEET, but not all young people are the same. We know that. Largely, making real huge generalisations about young people is never the way that we would work at Youth Employment UK, but where we can see patterns, in particular around mental health. When we have asked in the Youth Voice Census, the 2025 data set, 30% report anxiety as a top barrier to accessing work. We also know for young people who have accessed work, they feel like it took them a lot longer because of their anxiety and because of some of the challenges in and around being able to get through recruitment processes, understanding what employers were really asking for. Young people with mental health conditions are also 5 times more likely to be economically inactive, and 21% of those 18 to 24-year-olds with mental health problems were workless between 2018 and 2022. There's a real challenge we have as we start to build up and understand the picture. Whilst we can't blame COVID for everything, it really was a catalyst for some of these issues and opportunities. And actually, when we think about how we can support young people, if you were 18 in 2020, you will have started to age out of some of the help and support that will be available to you. Of course, the youth guarantee has more recently been extended, but there are real worries and concerns, not just in terms of how mental health will have impacted those who had key transition points around COVID-19, but those long-term impacts of kind of how you can move on, and how also we see less opportunities and less vacancies in the marketplace. So the competition of having been out of the system for 4 years against those who are freshly new kind of coming into the system too. We know also how personal circumstances and experience compound disadvantage too. Our Black respondents in the Youth Voice Census in 2025 were more likely than any other group to report the highest levels of anxiety. We saw high levels of anxiety for young men also, particularly around work. When we think about some of those personal circumstances, 31% of those with additional needs reported missing 10 days plus or more of education, where their peers who didn't have additional needs, that number was only around 18%. We are starting to see how those personal experience and how that disadvantage not just compounds, but starts really early into the education system too. We also see from Carers Week that approximately a quarter of young carers say their health and well-being has been negatively impacted by providing care. Having to miss opportunities and days across education, and having to miss opportunities across employment too. We know also how location and transport are a huge factor for young people. If you cannot access an opportunity, if it is not safe for you to get a bus to the local opportunity that might be available to you, that might be across retail, hospitality, it might be across warehouse work. If you are a young person who does not feel like they're able to access and see those opportunities for them, it is hugely disadvantaging you. We also know that the cost is a huge barrier to that as well. So we know how challenging it can be. We know that for some NEET young people, some of those disadvantages begin to compound whilst they are still in education. Missing days, missing attainment, attitudes to school and work, and motivation is really strongly associated with the risk of becoming NEET. is one of the big findings of our 2025 Youth Voice Census around young people who are missing days in education and missing days of work. One of the biggest reasons for it was a motivation to go. That's young people telling us one of the biggest barriers is they purely just don't have the motivation to go. Of course, there are issues around cost, there are issues around travel, there are issues around caring responsibilities. But when the world starts to compound and build around you, actually having the motivation to get up and do something is really challenging lots of our young people right now. Then we think about that, and we think about how young people's lives have changed in those moments and in those opportunities. We are still preparing young people in the same way we always have done. We're still having the same conversations about communication skills. We're still having the same conversations about being able to write a CV, and yet still just over half of young people feel like they could write a CV, but we aren't able or we aren't having the right conversations about how we can then sufficiently prepare young people for the world of work that's coming next. That's without me talking about AI and automation and any of those other big topics that we know are coming our way too. Actually, what we really have to understand first and foremost is how we can prepare the young people, the cohort that we have right now in front of us, the challenges, the issues that we have around mental health, personal responsibilities, demographics, that location and transport, and then what's happened across education and entertainment. How can we as employers, as those in the system, really think about what skills we're then really going to ask those young people to show up with, but also really be able to recognise and represent the skills that young people have grown throughout those processes as well. Actually, there are a different set of skills that are being required. It isn't all doom and gloom. If we're continuing to ask for the same things we did 10 years ago to this cohort, or who is just totally different now, we won't get those moments. One of the biggest ways we can do that is by really responding to the need that young people have around work experience and experience of work. 26% of respondents undertook work experience in last year's Youth Voice Census. That figure is drastically low for young people across secondary education, got slightly better for those in colleges and slightly better for those in university than it had been in previous years. But it's one of the biggest factors that young people tell us about being able to access work, being able to understand work, seeing people who are employed and enjoying work, understanding how the world of work really works once you get inside it, is one of the biggest contributors to confidence and participation, motivation in terms of being able to go. If you cannot see those opportunities, you will not do them. And as employers, whilst our world has changed around, for lots of us, flexible working, remote working, actually there is a real opportunity to be involved in things like EqualX that the Careers and Enterprise Company have launched recently, taking a flexible approach to work experience, taking a flexible approach to work, which I know we'll get into as we invite our guests to join us in the discussion today. I said earlier about how the political interest in youth employment has not been bigger than it was before. I've left this slide in. I think our members and those joining the session today will be really interested in this. This is the number of times that youth employment has been discussed in Parliament across the last decade. And you can see here, across 2026, just how many times it has been mentioned. This is at the real forefront of conversations, but actually what we do have to do is to make sure that these conversations being had about youth unemployment, youth employment, and how we can ensure more young people are able to access it, includes all of the groups that we really need to focus on. Young carers being a key example of that, and one that we really know and kind of understand to be a real game changer. I won't talk over Andy's detail and stats that he'll have coming through and with us today, but we'll really understand how we can bring the topic of youth unemployment back to young carers and make sure that works. So that is it from me. Please sit back and join me in welcoming Andy McGowan, the Policy and Practice Manager at the Young Carers Trust. Andy, welcome.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everyone. Really good to see people here this morning. Thank you for inviting us and for giving up your Monday morning. So, as Lauren said, I'm Andy McGowan, so I'm the Policy and Practice Manager. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Carers Trust, we have two hats. So we are a national carers organisation trying to improve support for unpaid carers of all ages, but we're also a network of local carer organisations. So we've got 136 local frontline carer services all across in terms of England, Scotland and Wales. So that means as a network, we collectively reach around about 1.1 million carers each year. So that really helps us to give us that both that understanding at a national level, but it also means for those employers who work in particular parts of the country, we can help connect to sort of your local carer service. So your local carer service will be the ones doing the carers assessments, will be the ones providing sort of peer support groups, emotional support, sort of financial in terms of income maximization support. And particularly in relation to this group for young carers and young adult carers, many of them will be offering sort of tailored employability or employment support for them as well. So it's really great to be sort of able to speak about this today because I think it's really timely. Obviously, we have the Milburn review underway at the moment, and we've got the Work and Pensions Committee, as has been said, looking at these two big issues of how do we tackle the issue of in terms of around 1 million young people not in education, employment, or training. And I think the reason we're so pleased around about this opportunity is because the reality is we're not going to hit sort of crack that figure if we're not thinking about what are the barriers for young carers. Because it's estimated that across the country there's about 1 million young carers, so under the age of 18, and about 500,000 what we call sort of young adult carers going up to sort of 24 from that perspective. So it's a significant cohort. And what we're seeing into when you look at this group is actually having significant impacts on education and on access to employment. Lots of the challenges that Lauren talked us through earlier around relying on public transport, for example. If you're a young adult carer who doesn't just have to get to work, but maybe has to go back to help get their lunch ready or make sure they get their medication or go to the pharmacy before it closes from that perspective to get their prescription, if you have to go and give personal care, or even if they've had a fall and you just need to go and check, are they okay from that perspective? So these can present real challenges. But I think it's fair to say, so we've been doing a lot of work with Youth Employment UK to really raise the profile of this group in the wider youth employment space. Because I think if we compare it to other groups, such as, for example, young people who've left the care system, or if we compare it to young people who've been on sort of receipt of free school meals at school, young carers haven't had so much of a focus into the national policy level as they do now. And it's really pleasing that both the Milburn Review and the Work and Pensions Committee have highlighted this as a group who we really need to be thinking about. And for you as well, many of your potential sort of talent in terms of what people who could be applying will have caring responsibilities because we're looking around about between 10 to 12% of all young adults having those sort of caring responsibilities. So my job is just to paint the picture as to what does this look like? What are some of the challenges being faced at the moment in relation to attainment? And it's a really exciting time. That's the data geek in me saying it's an exciting time. Apologies, because actually in the past 12 months, this has been the first time that we've ever had national attainment data to say actually, where do these challenges start for young carers? We all know in terms of actually impact on academic attainment has a huge link in terms of the sort of progression into employment or into training. And so as you can see here, in terms of actually GCSE, so we got figures out that came out in the autumn last year, which showed that a fewer than half of young carers were leaving secondary school with those sort of 5 GCSE passes, including English and maths. And fewer than half of young carers were passing their English and maths GCSEs as well. But it's also worth saying that actually this doesn't just start in terms of at sort of secondary age. What we also see is at primary school, young carers, again, fewer than half of them are meeting the expected standard across reading, writing, and maths before they've even left primary school at the age of 11. So I think in terms of the impact that you're seeing in terms of potential candidates, is undoubtedly much earlier in the system from that perspective. But as you can see on the slide here, there are some other challenges that young adult carers face that potentially some of their peers may not face from that sense. So practical things like actually having less time to actually even look at what opportunities out there. What are the differences between different pathways they might take? What might they need if they want to get into a particular career? But also in terms of just less time to be able to actually put time into their application and apply. We've seen a big sort of increasing trend over sort of recent years. I think particularly since COVID, of sort of some employers closing their deadlines, closing their applications, or reserving the right to close their applications when they found the right candidate. And I completely get that. I've just recruited for a role where we had over 200 applications for one single role from that perspective for an officer. But actually, for young carers and young adult carers, actually they may not have the time to just put a block out time in their weekend or block out time in that night to work on their application as soon as sort of the application's open. For some of them, they're having to balance in terms of their caring alongside maybe current paid work or their studies, as well as trying to do a really high quality application as well. Similarly, around flexibility for interviews, if actually you're needing in-person interviews and actually they've got to drop their younger siblings off at school in the morning because mum's not well enough, or they've got to get dad to an appointment from that perspective, or they've got to ring the GP at a certain time to get in terms of dad sort of review results from that perspective, that again can put in place barriers. But then there's also issues around finances. So we know for many young adult carers, they are sometimes the only sort of person bringing in any income in terms of beyond sort of wider benefits into the family. But actually, what we see with carers allowances, there are various different rules in the system which make it much harder for them to progress in their education, which can then help in terms of their career, and then beyond it in terms of as well. So, for example, there's something called the 21-hour rule, which means if they're doing more than 21 hours of study, then they would lose or no longer be eligible for carers allowance. Similarly, you may have heard lots about the earnings limit in terms of the carers allowance, but that only works out roughly to about 16 hours at sort of living wage from that perspective before they again lose their eligibility. So that doesn't just impact on them, but sometimes what we find, particularly what we've seen in terms of unintended consequences with young adult carers, is where actually we've seen over the past few years young workers getting proportionately higher pay rises in terms of rises in living wage than their older counterparts. But actually, what that we're finding with some young adult carers is actually they're going over the earnings limit just by getting that small pay rise, which then means they're actually worse off than they were if they hadn't have had the pay rise in the first place as well. But I think the final one in terms of, and this all of these issues were highlighted in the report you can see on the right hand side. So it was called Fair. May want us to focus on education and our future, but we have to put that second. And that was a report by the All Party Parliamentary Group for Young Carers and Young Adult Carers, which we support. And that really highlighted the range of different barriers that are in place. But it also included some of the sort of practical things and examples where employers have done things to help as well. And one of the final things was a lack of understanding around actually what does it mean for a young person to have caring responsibilities and trying to get into the workplace. Because when I speak to young adult carers, one of the things they often say is, actually, this is my first job. Actually, I'm not in a position to be able to feel like I can say to my employer, actually, I need you to be flexible, or I need this, or I need that for my caring role, because I don't have that capital. I don't have that in my back pocket to say I've got 10, 15, 20 years of experience from that perspective as well. So if I can have the next slide, please. So just a bit of interaction, just to make sure we're all awake, just as we're heading into lunchtime from that sense. What is this a picture of on the screen? If people can pop in the chat. Give people a minute. I'm hoping if people can see the chat. So. Anyone recognise?
Trying to find it. You can see them all trying to find where the chat is. Who's going to win? Jill looks like she's ready in pride. She's going to win.
Wimbledon. Any advances? There we go. There we go. Jill Ashley. If I had a prize, you would be getting the prize. That is centre court at Wimbledon from that perspective. So you might be wondering, why on earth is there a picture of centre court at Wimbledon? And it's not just because the sun made a rare appearance over the weekend, which made us think that Wimbledon season and Pimm's or strawberries and cream is soon going to be upon us. If you can just click next once for me, Lauren. See if this works. See if the tech. There we go. So centre court has a capacity of just under 15,000. So if we gave a ticket to centre court to Wimbledon to say, yep, you're going to watch the final at Wimbledon from that perspective, to every young person who cares for over 50 hours every single week, how many of that 15,000 seats do you think we'd have left for anybody else? So I'll just give people a second just to put into the chat, just to see in terms of their thoughts on that one. Zero? Any advances on zero? We get to see how optimistic people are feeling on a Monday morning, just about morning from that sense. None. That's sort of the vibes we're going for from that perspective. Do another just a couple of seconds. I think that's generally where people are heading. 200 from Georgia. So Georgia's got a little bit of optimism there. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. So I have put a picture on here in terms of, and you can click to the next one. You can click that animation as well. In terms of, you could see that in terms of actually, we would be able to fill centre court 3 times over, because we'd be in terms of 38,000 tickets short in terms of the number of young adults and young carers caring for over 50 hours a week. We've got in terms of over 50,000 young people who are caring for, and that's not them saying, oh, I'm caring 8 hours a day, 7 hours a day. That's the adults who did the census return saying that there's a child or a young adult caring for that much. And so the reason I highlight that is because we can be as flexible as we like in the world. We can have all the opportunities lined up for young adult carers. But if they're being relied on to do 50 hours of care a week, it's going to be really, really hard for them to be able to get into the job market or thrive in education. And so that's why it's so important to think, actually, what can you do as employers to really make it clear to prospective candidates and to the wider world, actually, we really understand carers. We really want to see carers be able to have the opportunity in our workplace. And what can we do to help enable that to happen? Now, I'm not here on a Monday just turned afternoon asking you to do it all. You can't do it all. We can't do it all from that sense, but actually we can all play our part. And so I think that's where, in terms of thinking, what can you do to really try and sort of raise that awareness, but also have that support in place for those who might want to apply, but also then actually in terms of keeping them in the workplace once they get there as well. So have the next slide, please. Because I think that takes us on in terms of actually to what can you do in practice. So I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague Bex, and even more grateful to Danny, who's a young adult carer, to join us to talk around actually what are some of these things and some of these experiences as well. So I'll hand over right over to you, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy. Yes, so lovely to meet you all. I'm Bex from Carers Trust, and I'm the Programme Manager here working on employability with young adult carers across the UK. And Danny and I are going to kind of tackle some of these questions to give you really practical advice. So, Danny, I'm going to ask you the first one if you'd like to speak to it. So, what can employers do to help young adult carers explore opportunities and feel confident engaging with employers?
Fantastic. So thank you, Bex. I first thought about kind of informal engagement and those trusted spaces. So an example of this is I engaged with my employers for a music festival initially. And I initially joined up for kind of the creative side, but through workshops and informal interactions with my employers, it opened up to more opportunities like research, evaluation, and accessibility, what eventually led to a paid position. And it's really helpful to have that kind of progression as well. So that started off as a stall event, what then led to volunteering, what then led to paid work. And now I lead accessibility strategies across multiple festivals in quite a good position with them. And that really highlights how kind of effective that kind of progression, that confidence building is, rather than that single interaction. Kind of to come back to the confidence building as well, it's nice to have those less kind of high pressure environments like career fairs, and to have kind of ways to proactively kind of reach out to young adult carers as well, using the relatable language to make it easier for engagement.
Thanks, Danny. Fab. And just to add on to that, I think something that we also hear from carers is being really explicit about the language that you use in terms of outreach. So there's a quote that we have a young carer gave at our conference last year, and it's, "Whenever I see a list of minority or marginalised groups, young carers are rarely on there. we're so underrepresented that we aren't even on the list of underrepresented groups. So in terms of doing your kind of outreach, it's okay to be really explicit about kind of welcoming carers and understanding, signaling that you have that understanding of flexibility and doing kind of those adaptive practices and reasonable adjustments for carers. I also want to pick up on something Danny said about going through those kind of trusted routes. So at Carers Trust, as I said, we run a program specifically with young adult carers on employability. And we work with that network across the UK to make that happen. And actually, it's a really fantastic way to reach young adult carers and work with us to kind of build something that is particularly accessible for carers and reaching them kind of on the ground. So do take us up on that offer and kind of work with local organisations who might have those relationships and can support you to be really flexible in terms of your outreach, because we know that sometimes the traditional things don't work. So actually meeting carers where they are, and that might be offering more flexible sessions, so kind of like online sessions, lunch and learns, those kind of things, rather than the traditional routes, can be really valuable. Fab. Thank you, Danny. So I'm going to come to you for the next question. So how can employers design work experience and placements that genuinely work for young adult carers?
Fantastic. So to tie both the questions together, I also think that I'm quite proactive and I can advocate a lot for my my voice and skills, but not everyone has those chances to develop those skills. So being able to create some sort of guidance into the outreach can also help level the playing field. In terms of kind of work experience and placements, it has to be about flexibility from the offset rather than kind of seeming like an adjustment, like an add-on. That might look like flexible hours or hybrid options, or the ability to adapt schedules where caring responsibilities can change, particularly because it can be unpredictable. Another point would be to kind of focus on the outcomes rather than time spent. I know for me, I particularly prefer to kind of work from home as well. So we're not looking at the hours that I spend in the office, but actually when you're looking at the outcomes, it's I won't blow my horn too much, but it's quite good. And then with the personalized support as well, I took part in mentorship and outreach programs where I got to do one-to-one shadowing and structured training with a mentor. And that personalized approach really built my kind of skills and confidence and for practical support as well. So like help with the travel to different locations, made it quite accessible for me. Additionally, kind of having a named contact to create those kind of clear, safe lines of communication. I'm quite open about my caring responsibilities, but a lot of my friends kind of don't ask for help or disclose their responsibilities. So they're kind of worried as seen unreliable. So having a named contact who is proactively talking about the support available rather than waiting for, saying, here's the support available, but you have to kind of come to us to find out more, to be really open on that. And you use for relational language, because a lot of people don't identify as a carer, but they know that they take care of their mom, dad, brother, sister, etc.
Thanks, Danny. No, it's really nice to hear your kind of actual reflections on your personal experience, because I think you touched on an important point there in terms of thinking outside those traditional work placements. So kind of the 1 week work experience block might not necessarily work, but how can you actually tie that flexibility into the offer? So I'm going to give you an example of, we work closely with the civil service, and they have a going forward into employment scheme, which is specific for carers. And what they do within that is ring fence a post for carers. And then they do a streamlined application process. And then once they're in work, they have that in-body support, to kind of really support them in post. So there are different ways around it. We also work with Springpod, who offer virtual work experience. So again, thinking outside that kind of traditional in-house work experience offer, to be really flexible in that sense. And Danny touched on it there again. So the really practical things that we hear in terms of how you can design an accessible work placement would be to support potentially with travel. If you were able to, give a small bursary to young people, just so that they can really be sure that they can engage in that sense. Because we understand, obviously, there's fluctuating kind of pressures on young carers. I think also something that would be fantastic is kind of championing lived experience. So one of the things I hear constantly is carers really like hearing from people who've gone through the same experience with them. And actually part of the work we do is carer awareness training with employers. And I've never left a session where someone taking part in that session hasn't realised they themselves are a carer. So actually, if people are comfortable to come forward and speak about their experience of balancing work and care, that can often be a really powerful tool and really work for young carers so that they can kind of see themselves and what their potential future pathways could look like. So again, you can be really flexible in how you build that in, but it's often a really powerful tool. Great. And then Danny, so final question. What practical steps do you think employers can take to recruit, support and retain young adult carers once they move into employment?
Great. So I'm currently in a full-time intern position, so that's what I want to be kind of drawing from. To really emphasize, like I have through all the questions about proactive conversations, we've heard it a lot through the national inquiry as well, but support is often too reactive and relies on that disclosure. So giving the clarity and reassurance from the offset removes pressures so we don't have to ask in the moments of crisis. I found that really helpful from my employers as well. And then also kind of supporting beyond kind of just the entry point as well. So an example of this is I've been able to go to lots of different conferences, talk about my research and my work. And a lot of the support about that is kind of financial support. So often, well, I'm the only income bringer for my whole family. And also, I often have extra kind of financial strains because of my caring responsibilities. Sometimes that's travel or whatever else. So, for conferences and to share my work, I get a conference fund for my internship, what covers all travel entry fees, and also for Carers Trust covers travel reimbursement as well. Again, to touch on flexibility, I can kind of, although I'm working full time, I can work from home part of the week. And in a previous role, I also chose my working days. And that meant that I could really kind of contribute as much as I could and develop skills very quickly and gain meaningful experience that supported my progression. I'm very lucky in this position. He's just gone out for a cup of tea, I believe. But I've got a really good line manager, and that makes a big difference. I can speak openly to him anytime and book those one-to-ones. I've got good access to HR, what sits right next to him, and a staff carer network for informal support. But I know that consistent support isn't well, that support isn't consistent everywhere. And I've got a colleague who's a young adult carer in the same building, and I know that dynamic was different, and it was only me sharing about support I got that she found out what she could access. So again, that's another kind of area about the care awareness training to help shape those day-to-day experiences of our young adult carers and our carers. But I think it's also important to recognise the skills that carers bring as well. In my own experience, I've had feedback from senior leaders on my time management and ability to think in systems under pressure and coordinate multiple projects at once, skills that I've developed through caring. In my current internship, I'm also invited into lots of senior management meetings with directors to share my reflections, and that's given me insight to strategic planning, governance, risk management. And it means that I've been able to apply those skills in funding applications and wider projects. So kind of having that flexibility, trust and informed support to develop my skills means that, if I say so myself, I've been able to thrive and bring those kind of high transferable skills where it's really valued really in this workspace.
Thanks, Danny, and it's lovely to hear your manager recognizing those skills, because that's something we see a lot. Those really transferable skills are really strong within young adult carers. So really kind of championing them, cannot say that, championing them is really powerful. I just want to add a couple of points to that. So in terms of recruitment, Andy touched on it at the start, but carers, because of their responsibilities, may have missed out on traditional routes in terms of schooling and potentially going on to higher education. So actually really thinking as early as the recruitment stage about what you're asking for in terms of going into employment. So asking for a degree, for example, what's the reasoning behind that? And it may be helpful to kind of reflect on those processes in terms of what you're asking for, and potentially moving to a more competency and skills-based way of recruitment. Like Danny shared, there's a lot of key skills there, but they might not necessarily be shown in typical qualifications. We also know that identification can often be an issue with carers. So actually asking at this recruitment stage, do you have caring responsibilities, can be a really powerful way in terms of following up with carers and providing that wraparound support for once they get into post. We know that flexible working is really powerful, but also highlighting the potential for the carers leave. So the Carers Leave Act in 2023 entitles carers to 1 week of unpaid leave a year. Obviously, the gold standard is paid, but actually highlighting that you're actively engaging with those sorts of things is really powerful, especially in terms of retaining young adult carers and making that support really visible. We've heard that often carers look for the disability confident sign, and although this isn't directly related to caring, it kind of signals that you're open to reasonable adjustments and being really clear about that. So that's a really powerful way. I won't go into the supportive line manager again, but we know that that's the biggest factor for supporting young adult carers in work. And also it's a fantastic way to upskill your line managers more broadly, because we know that this supports all staff across kind of their experiences within the workplace. And I also think one thing you touched on there, Danny, as well, which is really powerful, is building a community. So those internal carers networks can be really powerful in terms of supporting carers, but as I said, the lived experience piece of knowing that people have maybe shared an experience with you can be a really fantastic way to kind of build community within the workplace. So if you are interested in finding out a bit more, I'll pop it in the chat, but please do get in touch with us. We'd love to engage you on the programme, and we can support you to kind of build those opportunities and also reach young adult carers. So thank you, Danny, and I'll hand it back over to the team.
Brilliant, thank you, Danny. I'm glad your line manager's gone out for lunch, because I think you're about to get hundreds of people be like, "Hey, come and work for us instead." So I'm glad that happens. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Danny. Thank you for sharing so much insight and so much richness behind it. I'll give everybody a moment to find the chat again and toggle between the screens as I will. So if you do have a specific question you want me to cover, either pop your hand up or pop it in the chat. I'm really happy to do both things and work both ways. I guess I had a couple of reflections as I was thinking about that. There is this sort of line within it about making opportunities be flexible and supportive, being the green flag, if you like, to young people to say, hey, like, come and start the conversation with us. And then it feels like, Rebecca and Danny, there is this moment and movement of employers, and the first thing young people might do is see that you are generally a good employer to start with, and then they might look further into the specific support that you provide for young carers. I suppose in terms of starting, what's the biggest green flag you can show? What's the biggest thing when you're looking at an employer that they can do? Because for lots of employers, I think particularly SMEs, they'd probably more often than not always be open to a conversation, but how can they show that to you?
I'm happy to kind of go first. So I was kind of thinking about what's one thing you could do tomorrow, and I suppose it's for proactive conversations. about flexibility and review how visible and accessible that support is. And those small changes, I think, could have a huge impact. And then I'll hand over to Bex now.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, I think a really easy one is actually writing the words "we welcome carers" into any of your activity, because the first thing we know that young carers do is go and Google carer-friendly employers, and that kind of piece will come up for carers and signal that you were open to that initial conversation. So yeah, naming it explicitly in kind of your recruitment pieces is always a really helpful place to start.
Brilliant. And to be as explicit as that, it's not just being a good place to work. Actually, we welcome young carers. And what we hear from most young people is that everybody wants to feel like they are welcome, and actually being able to call it out and be really clear about those groups is really important. In terms of, there are some other questions around care awareness training for employers. I assume Bex will send all of that over, and we'll be able to share some of that information with people as they come through. From a kind of a quick win perspective, I know we've talked a lot about having that open dialogue, but I think about us as a small business. Where would you put us to start, Rebecca? Like where are we gonna go first, Bex? Is it your website?
Yes, absolutely. I'll share that with. I think it's a really fantastic way to kind of engage with us through the website or email the team. Because as I said, we have those kind of established links across the UK, and it's a really great way to get to know what's happening in your area and tap into that local support. So yes, I'll make sure I share that information, but it's a great place to start.
Brilliant. And in terms of, we talked about kind of green flags, how we can show people, what's the biggest red flag you see or you hear from young carers, Dan? If you've got one, when you're kind of looking at how a job advert is written, whether it's about kind of lots of travel, like fast paced, dynamic, what are the things that make you go, oh, that's probably not going to be for me?
I need one moment just to think to that. So if you go to Bex first, and then I'll
Absolutely,
answer.
Thanks, Danny. Funnily enough, one of the things we have that people say puts them off immediately is the expression fast-paced environment within this, because I think it signals that they're expected to keep a constant they can't kind of bring their caring role into it, which can be very unpredictable and kind of changeable. But I also think it's that I suppose that lack of flexibility, but I think you can signal in terms of a red flag is, I think it's just like not really showing that you can be flexible, or that you understand kind of the pace of things. And I think actually using kind of plain language and talking to people so that they understand that you're human, you're real employers, you understand kind of that everyone has their home life as well, is really useful. So yeah, that kind of cold front, I suppose, can be a bit of a red flag for young carers.
And then just to come in with my reflected point, I think something that happens quite a lot actually is that the responsibility sits with the young adult carer or the young carer to navigate that system. So it could sound like they should disclose, or they need to ask for that support. And I know that's a really hard dynamic to balance, but that's what I'm on about, for kind of proactive conversations, because then it can lead to better retainment, and it's kind of prevention focused as well.
Brilliant. And do you think then that would make it more likely that young adult carers would self-identify? And I guess the challenge is understanding more about what support is needed, but without making you feel as though you've got to jump through hurdles, announce it to everybody, approach everybody, and ask for lots of help on the first kind of day or week to be able to access it. As hitting that line between the two. Do you say that's fair?
Absolutely. I've got my thoughts, and I'll let Bex share as well. But I kind of I do a few of these kind of chats with employers and healthcare staff, and I say about kind of inform about the support available, what a caring role may look like, and then kind of hold that psychological safe space and kind of just let them have that empowered choice, and maybe you're co-creating that plan with them of this might help. And I think that's a really good way of kind of going about it. Additionally, just to add to that, I know we're focused on young people, but actually kind of 40 to 60 people of adults will be a carer at some point in their lifetime as well. So having this practice in place will be a good point for nearly all your workforce.
I think that's such a true point. We are kind of youth employment. We could go 11 to 30, but actually, good youth employment is good employment for everybody. Go across that thing, and I can imagine it's the same from that caring perspective as well. Rebecca, would you add anything to that in terms of where we might see employers be nervous to, or kind of get it a bit wrong because it feels like they're forcing people to self-identify before they can get help?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as Amy said, it's about inviting that. No one has to say anything, kind of that they don't want to. And actually, a really powerful way to do that can be an employer passport. So it's sitting down with someone, almost like a well-being plan, I suppose. And then in that sense, that's kind of something that you might offer all your staff. How can we support you? Is there anything we need to know that might change? And actually, that person can fill it in as they settle in, start to feel more comfortable. If things change for them, they can update it, just so you have that written. And I think Danny mentioned earlier, it's about kind of stopping people getting to the point of crisis where they feel like they can't say anything. You can invite that ongoing conversation is a really helpful way, as you said, to support everyone in the workplace.
There are two more specific questions, not quick fire, they don't have to be that quick fire, but within the chat and conversation, Emily was asking where the best place to signpost young people about the possible income effect or allowance, actually, as they start to take up paid internships or the summer. Where's the best place for those young people to access the right information?
Yeah, we typically signpost them to the job centre. They can go through in a lot more detail because every case is quite individual. So that's the best place to start.
Brilliant. Okay. Not just the AI summary, but talking to the job centre about your specific experience.
Yeah.
And is there a specific job centre that lends itself to more employability opportunities with young carers?
Danny, do you want to speak to that one?
Yeah, absolutely. In my personal opinion, well, like anything I'm saying, I suppose, it's less about a specific centre or sector, and it's more about how the job roles are designed and supported, I suppose. And we can support over all sectors with flexibility and those inclusive practices. Yeah, I think that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I echo that. And anything outside kind of traditional working hours. But I think we see young carers are 59% more likely than their peers to go into caring and social care roles. And that's often because that's what people know. But actually, in terms of broadening horizons, no sector's off limit. We see a lot of variety in what's interesting to carers. So yeah, it's really about kind of signposting that support more than the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see how some sectors might on the surface feel like a more accessible way of doing it, and some would feel more difficult. But actually, I can imagine what the holy grail would be is that all sectors feel like they're accessible to young carers. There are opportunities for everybody to be able to access the support they need and to be able to do good work and feel fulfilled by it. So brilliant. Rebecca, Danny, thank you so much for sharing information, insight, and your stories. I think from my side of things, Danny, what I really loved is your talk of kind of judging you on outcomes, not hours or kind of presenteeism. It's something we see a lot across organisations, and there are many young carers, no doubt, kind of identified or not within the workforces of employers and those working wider across the sector within this room, and actually basing on outcomes, opening up for good, honest conversations, I think is certainly what we would take away. So thank you so much for being online and able to support today. What I will ask before you go is that we're squashing in one more webinar before the end of March. We are working with the Futures Foundation to do Youth Employment in Focus, the evolving policy landscape, all of the latest information, insight from the Youth Guarantee and the Milburn Review. So please join. George, I can see, has already put the note in the chat. You can scan the QR code if you so please. Talking about good employment and good youth employment, the Good Youth Employment Benchmark is open until the end of this month. If you are a member at Youth Employment UK that has not completed it yet, you need to get on your dashboard and do that immediately. But if you are someone who hasn't engaged with Youth Employment UK before, you're not a member, this is something you'd like to talk about. This is the first of its kind digital tool that measures and monitors your practice. It will also allow you to access tailored information, advice and guidance. Will come with links to the Carers Trust to be able to support and action kind of next step growth in your strategy and early career support that you need. And then finally, as I mentioned, for the 9th year, the Youth Voice Census launched today. So the 2026 Youth Voice Census has gone live today. It is now open until the 8th of June. It captures the experiences of young people aged 11 to 30 across the country. We are also doing specialised reports across 6 mayoral regions this year too. It is what gives us such a depth of insight, information and intelligence on what's happening for young people. We're really proud that we get to do in-person sessions with the Carers Trust each year too. So the richness of the Youth Voice Census is something that should be shaping and developing your strategies, the information and the way that you kind of show up and represent young people. So that is it from me, just on time. Look at us for experts on this session today. Thank you so much all for joining, and we look forward to seeing you on the 30th of March for the next webinar. Thank you.